had always wanted to get away from it all. The noise, the rush, the constant pull of the city. So when my friend offered me a weekend in a remote cabin up in the woods, I jumped at the chance. It was supposed to be a relaxing retreat, quiet, peaceful, and far removed from the hustle of everyday life. Little did I know that my attempt to escape would only lead me deeper into an unsettling experience that I'd never forget. I arrived at the cabin just before sunset. The drive had taken longer than expected, mostly because the last stretch of road was a narrow, unpaved path that wound its way through dense woods. The trees grew close to the road, their thick trunks casting long shadows across the dirt. I had to drive slow to avoid hitting the occasional rock or deep pothole, but eventually the cabin came into view. It was small, weathered, and made from old logs. A porch ran along the front, the wooden planks creaking as I stepped onto it. The windows, slightly fogged with age, looked out into the woods that stretched endlessly in every direction. The air was still, almost unnervingly so, and there wasn't a sound except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. As I opened the door, a rush of musty air hit me. The cabin was dimly lit, but it was cozy in a way. It had that rustic charm, old furniture, a stone fireplace, a thick, woolen rug on the floor. The place was stocked with the basics. A few cans of food in the kitchen, a small stack of firewood beside the hearth, and a couple of blankets draped over the couch. I tossed my bag onto the bed in the back room and set about making a fire in the fireplace. It wasn't cold yet, but I knew it would be when night fell. The first evening was uneventful. I spent a few hours unpacking, enjoying the peace and quiet, and then I settled in front of the fire with a book. The crackling of the flames was the only noise, and it soon became oddly soothing. As the night wore on, the woods outside seemed to come alive with the sounds of wildlife. A distant owl hooted, and the occasional rustle in the underbrush reminded me that I wasn't alone out here. I made dinner, a simple stew with some of the canned goods, and ate it quietly, feeling the weight of the isolation settling in. There was no phone service here, no internet, no distractions. Just the fire, the cabin, and the forest stretching out in every direction. It was exactly what I needed. At least that's what I thought. After dinner, I cleaned up and decided to take a walk outside before it got too dark. I grabbed my jacket and stepped out onto the porch. The air was cool and crisp, a refreshing change from the stale atmosphere inside. The sun had set by now, and the sky was a deep, inky blue, dotted with stars. The forest was silent, as though holding its breath. I couldn't even hear the usual sounds of crickets or rustling leaves. I ventured out toward the edge of the woods, my boots crunching against the dry leaves. The ground here was uneven, with roots twisting out of the earth in strange patterns. I stopped for a moment, feeling the stillness around me, and thought about heading back. But then I saw something, a flicker of light in the distance, deeper in the woods. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks. But no, there was definitely something out there. A small light moving between the trees. It wasn't a flashlight or any kind of torch I recognized. It seemed too erratic, too strange. I felt a chill run down my spine as I stared at it, unsure whether I should investigate or head back to the cabin. My curiosity got the better of me, and I started walking in its direction. The deeper I went, the harder it became to see. The trees were thick, their branches interwoven, blocking out much of the starlight. The ground was uneven, and I had to step carefully, avoiding rocks and roots. The flickering light continued ahead, moving in a jerky pattern, like it was being carried by someone or something who didn't want to be seen. I kept moving forward, drawn in by some inexplicable urge. Eventually, the light stopped. I froze, watching. It seemed to hover in place, as if waiting for me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and an uncomfortable feeling began to gnaw at me. The quiet of the forest around me was suffocating, oppressive. And then the light moved again, this time in a straight line, heading further into the woods. I followed, my steps quickening, but I had no idea what I was chasing anymore. I wasn't sure if I even wanted to find out, but there was something about the movement of the light that made me feel as if I had no choice but to follow it. Minutes turned into what felt like hours, and I had no idea where I was. The woods had become thick and dense, the trees towering above me like ancient giants. The flickering light grew fainter, harder to follow, but it was still there. I continued to push through the thick brush, ignoring the branches that scraped against my face and arms. And then suddenly the light stopped again, but this time there was no movement. I stood there, breathless, staring into the dark. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There was no clear source of the light, just a faint glow hanging in midair, like it had materialized out of thin air. I took a step forward. A crack echoed through the stillness, sharp and loud. I froze. Everything went silent. No rustling leaves, no distant owl. Nothing. It was then that I heard its soft, faint footsteps behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest, but saw nothing. The forest was empty, the trees stretching endlessly in every direction. But I wasn't alone. I could feel it. Something was watching me. Panic surged in my chest. My feet started to move on their own, backing away from the spot where the light had been. But no matter how fast I moved, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that something was closing in on me. I stumbled, tripping over a root, and fell hard to the ground. The world seemed to spin around me. I lay there for a moment, gasping for breath, trying to steady myself. My mind was racing. I needed to get back to the cabin. I needed to get out of here. I scrambled to my feet, my legs shaking with adrenaline. The sound of footsteps behind me grew louder, closer, but I couldn't turn around. My heart was hammering in my chest, my breath coming in short, frantic gasps. I had to get out. I had to move. I pushed through the underbrush, not caring about the branches slashing at my face or the rough ground beneath me. I needed to get back to the cabin. I needed to feel safe again. And then, in the distance, I saw it. The flicker of light. No, the glow was gone, but I recognized the shape of the cabin. I wasn't far. I was almost there. I broke into a full sprint, running as fast as I could. My breath was ragged, my body aching, but I didn't stop. Couldn't stop. The footsteps behind me were relentless now, following me, closing in. I could hear them. I could feel them. I reached the cabin, slammed the door behind me, and locked it with trembling hands. I stood there for a long moment, my back pressed against the door, trying to catch my breath. The cabin was silent again, but the fear still gripped me. The forest outside was dark and ominous. I had no idea what I had just experienced. It didn't feel like a natural phenomenon. Felt wrong. But as I stood there, breathing heavily in the silence, I realized something. There was no way I was going back out there. Not tonight. Not ever. I wasn't sure what I had seen or heard in those woods, but I knew it was enough to make me leave tomorrow. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I sat by the fire, watching the flames flicker and dance, trying to calm my nerves. I tried to convince myself that it had all been some weird, unexplained event. Maybe it was just the isolation getting to me. Maybe I had imagined the light, the footsteps, the presence that had been lurking in the shadows. But deep down, I knew I wasn't alone in those woods. The next morning, I packed my things in a hurry, my hands shaking as I stuffed my belongings into my bag. I didn't even bother with breakfast. The sun was already up, but it did little to ease the heavy feeling that lingered in my chest. I wasn't sticking around to find out more. As I drove away, I glanced back at the cabin, its silhouette standing against the trees. For a moment, I thought I saw movement in one of the windows, but when I looked again, it was empty. I didn't stop to check. I just kept driving, my foot heavy on the accelerator. The woods had swallowed the cabin whole, and I wasn't going back. It wasn't until much later that I realized something. I had never actually seen the source of that light, the thing that had led me deeper into the woods. I had only followed it, driven by something I still couldn't explain. And I'd never been able to shake the feeling that something, or someone, was still watching me. But I made it out. That's all that mattered. And I swore to myself that I'd never return to those woods. Not ever again. And as for the cabin, stayed out there, somewhere deep in the forest, hidden among the trees, waiting for the next person who would wander too far into the darkness. It was supposed to be just a quiet weekend getaway, a break from the constant noise of the city, the kind of place you imagine when you want to escape. A cabin tucked away in the woods, far from the chaos of life, with nothing but trees and the sound of the wind to keep you company. But, as with all good plans, things don't always go the way you expect them. I had been craving solitude for months. The constant buzz of work, the endless emails, the noise of the city, it was all becoming too much. So when my friend Tom told me about his family's cabin, deep in the forest, I jumped at the chance to get away. It was a small, rustic cabin, he said. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, just peace and quiet. The perfect place to clear my head. Tom gave me the key and a few vague directions. It wasn't hard to find. I simply had to head north for about an hour, take a left at the old mill, and then follow a gravel road for another 20 minutes. The last stretch was rough, barely wide enough for my car to fit, but eventually, I made it. The cabin sat in a small clearing, surrounded by thick trees. I could barely see any neighbors, and that was exactly what I wanted. I pulled up to the cabin, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I could finally breathe. The air was clean and crisp. It felt like I was in a completely different world, one where nothing else mattered. I grabbed my bag, walked up to the porch, and unlocked the door. The smell of wood and the faint scent of mothballs filled my nose as I stepped inside. It was exactly as I had imagined, simple, cozy, and a little worn. There was a small stone fireplace on one side, a couch with an old quilt draped over it, and a kitchen with outdated appliances. Everything about it was perfectly normal, almost too normal, like a place no one had touched in years. The cabin had no real electricity, just a few solar-powered lights and a generator that would kick on if I needed it. Tom had warned me that the generator was temperamental, so I figured I would try to make do with the few lights that worked. I dropped my bag on the couch and started unpacking, putting my clothes in the small wooden dresser and setting up my few things in the bathroom. The evening was drawing near, and I wanted to make sure I had everything sorted before it got dark. The last thing I wanted was to be fumbling around in the dark for a flashlight. By the time I finished unpacking, the sun had dipped behind the trees, and the woods outside had grown quiet. A deep silence had settled in, one that felt almost oppressive. The kind of silence that makes you aware of how much noise you usually take for granted. Cars, people, the hum of your own thoughts. In the woods, that silence felt wrong. I lit the small fire in the fireplace, just to add some warmth to the cabin. The flames flickered and crackled, casting long shadows across the room. As the fire took hold, I found myself feeling a little better. My mind, which had been running nonstop, slowly started to unwind. But then I heard something. It was a faint sound, barely noticeable, but it stopped me in my tracks. A thud, followed by a rustling sound. My first thought was that it was an animal, a raccoon maybe, or a deer. There were plenty of creatures in these woods, and they were often more curious than I expected. I ignored it at first, thinking nothing of it, but when the sound came again, I froze. It was coming from outside the cabin. I walked over to the window, careful not to make a sound, and peered out into the night. The woods were still, and there was nothing in sight, just trees and shadows. I tried to shake off the unease that was beginning to settle in my chest. It had to be an animal. There was no one else out here, right? I wasn't in the habit of overthinking things, but the stillness of the place, combined with the strange sound, made my nerves buzz. The night went on, and I sat by the fire, trying to distract myself with a book. But every time I thought I had settled, I'd hear another sound, this time closer than before. A knock, followed by the same rustling. It was almost as if someone, or something, was pacing around the cabin, listening to the rhythm of the fire crackling inside. I set the book down, feeling my stomach tighten. The thought of being out here alone, so far from help, made me realize how vulnerable I truly was. I stood up and made my way to the door. Felt ridiculous, but I had to check. There was no way I was going to just sit there and let my imagination run wild. I grabbed a flashlight, swung the door open, and stepped outside. The cold night air hit me sharp and biting. The forest was alive with the sounds of crickets and distant rustling, but there was nothing unusual. No footsteps. No signs of anything that could explain the noise. I looked around, scanning the trees, but everything appeared normal. The only movement was the occasional sway of the branches in the wind. My heart slowed as I realized how ridiculous I was being. I turned to go back inside when something caught my eye. A small patch of dirt near the edge of the porch was disturbed. It didn't seem like anything significant at first, but when I took a closer look, I noticed the footprints. They weren't animal prints. They were human. The size of the prints suggested they belonged to someone with a heavy build. I felt a chill run through me. The footsteps weren't from earlier, they were fresh. Panic crept up my spine as I stared at the prints. Who else could be out here? No one was supposed to be around. Tom had said the cabin was isolated, and I hadn't seen another car for miles. My mind raced through possible explanations, but none made sense. I stood there for a long moment, trying to make myself believe that it was nothing. But then I heard something behind me, a snap of a twig. I whipped around, flashlight in hand, but there was nothing. I rushed back into the cabin, locking the door behind me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I stood in the center of the room. My thoughts raced, and every noise from outside seemed louder, more menacing. What should I do? Should I call the police? No, they would take hours to get out here. And even then, what would they do? It was just me and the woods. I tried to focus. The rational part of my mind kept telling me to stay calm. But it was hard. The cabin, once cozy, now felt like a trap. The walls were closing in, and the fire in the hearth no longer gave off any warmth. Then it happened again. The knock. It was loud, deliberate this time, 3 knocks in quick succession. My breath caught in my throat. I froze. My pulse thundered in my ears as I stood motionless, listening. There was no sound after that. Just the wind. Just silence. I needed to get out. There was no way I was staying here another night. The urge to run had become overpowering, but something held me back. I couldn't shake the feeling that if I left, whatever was out there would follow me. So I did what I could. I called Tom. Maybe he'd know what to do. Maybe he could explain everything. The call went straight to voicemail. It had been a rough few months. Work was overwhelming, and the city was starting to feel more like a pressure cooker than a place to live. I needed a break. So when I saw an online listing for a secluded cabin in the woods, something about it called to me. It promised peace, quiet, and the chance to unwind, away from everything that had been stressing me out. I packed my bags and drove for hours, making my way to the cabin. The last stretch was down a long dirt road that twisted and turned between tall, dense trees. The sky was a murky gray, a steady drizzle pattering on the windshield, and the air had that damp, earthy smell that made you feel like the world was alive with secrets. The kind of smell you only get when you're far away from civilization. The cabin came into view suddenly. It wasn't much to look at from the outside. Old wood, a sagging porch, windows covered in dust. It looked like a place that had been forgotten by time. The kind of place people forgot to check on, tucked away deep in the woods. I wasn't expecting luxury, but even so, it felt oddly abandoned, like it had been sitting there, untouched for years. A small shiver ran down my spine as I parked the car, but I shrugged it off. The key was under the welcome mat. It was rusty and old, the type you only find on vintage doors. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, the hinges creaking like something was trying to warn me. The smell inside was musty, like stale air had been locked in here forever. It looked like the cabin hadn't been properly cleaned in a long time. Dust on every surface, cobwebs in the corners, the couch cushions stained with age. The dim lighting gave everything a weird, washed-out tone. But at the same time, it felt strangely cozy. I guess it was that rustic charm people always talked about. I set my bags down and took a look around. There was a fireplace against one wall, the kind that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The kitchen was tiny, with an old wood stove and a few mismatched dishes. A small dining table sat against the window, which overlooked a dense forest, the trees stretching out as far as I could see. The rain outside only made the whole place feel more isolated, as though the world had shrunk to just this small cabin and the woods around it. I felt my tension easing just a bit. Maybe it was the silence, maybe it was the isolation, but I could already feel myself starting to unwind. I went to the back of the cabin and found the small staircase leading upstairs. The wood creaked under my feet, and I noticed that the walls upstairs were made of rough-hewn logs, like something out of an old frontier house. The bedroom had a large, creaky bed, the sheets looking like they hadn't been touched in years. A nightstand beside the bed had a flickering oil lamp on it, which I lit, casting a soft glow over the room. It wasn't fancy, but it was enough. I unpacked a little, and as I moved around, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Not in any obvious way, but more like an unshakable instinct. I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it was just the solitude. Maybe I was just being paranoid. I spent the rest of the evening in the cabin, reading, drinking coffee, and listening to the rain. As night fell, the wind picked up outside, causing the trees to sway and creak in the distance. The fire in the fireplace crackled, filling the cabin with warmth, and I finally began to feel like I could relax. But that night, as I lay in bed, trying to sleep, I kept hearing noises. Little things, the occasional thud, a scraping sound that seemed to come from somewhere below the floorboards. At first, I told myself it was just the house settling, the wind, animals outside. But after a few hours, I began to wonder if there was something more to it. The noises grew louder, and I swore I heard something moving, something dragging itself across the floor. I lay still, trying to convince myself it was nothing, but I couldn't sleep. The creaking continued, and then, at one point, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A faint scratching sound, like something with sharp nails, just beyond the walls. My heart hammered in my chest. I tried to ignore it, rolling over and pulling the blanket tighter around me. But then the noise came again, closer this time, as if whatever it was had moved into the room with me. I dared not open my eyes. My mind raced with thoughts. Was it an animal? Some kind of insect crawling around? Or was there something else here? Something I couldn't see? I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I heard a noise, I froze, holding my breath, listening to the silence in between. It wasn't just the sound itself, it was the feeling. The sensation of something being in the cabin with me. Not a person, not a ghost, but something else. Something that didn't belong. The morning light finally filtered through the cracks in the blinds, and I forced myself out of bed. The cabin was still, almost too still. The noises had stopped, but the dread still lingered in the pit of my stomach. I decided to go for a walk. Maybe the fresh air would clear my head, help me make sense of everything. I grabbed my jacket and left the cabin, stepping out into the damp morning. The woods were eerily quiet, the trees swaying slightly in the wind, their branches creaking. As I walked, I noticed something strange. There were marks on the ground, scratches, deep and jagged, like something heavy had dragged itself across the earth. I followed the trail, stepping over rocks and fallen branches, until it led me to a small clearing. There, in the middle of the clearing, was something that made my stomach turn. A large, dark stain on the ground. It was dried blood, the kind that had been there for a while, the way it had turned dark and sticky. But what was more unsettling was the shape of it. It looked like something had been dragged to the spot. I stepped back, my heart racing. It was then that I noticed something else. Footprints. Large, heavy ones. Not animal prints, but something human-sized. I looked around, scanning the trees, the woods, but I saw nothing. My mind raced. Was there someone out here? Had someone been watching me? I turned and hurried back to the cabin, locking the door behind me as soon as I was inside. The silence was almost deafening. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something wasn't right with this place. That afternoon, I decided to head back into town. I couldn't explain it, but I needed to get out of the cabin, out of the woods. The feeling of being watched, of something lurking in the shadows, was unbearable. But as I reached the car and started the engine, I saw something in the rearview mirror. A figure standing in the distance, just beyond the tree line. My blood ran cold. I knew it was time to leave. I didn't look back as I drove down the dirt road, away from the cabin, away from whatever was in those woods. I couldn't explain what had happened, what I had seen or felt, but as I left, I promised myself I would never return. Some places, I guess, are meant to stay forgotten. I've been planning this trip for months. A weekend alone in a remote cabin, no distractions, no technology. Just me and nature. I needed a break from everything. Work, the city, and most of all, the noise in my head that never seemed to stop. The cabin wasn't much, but it was isolated, tucked away in a valley, miles from the nearest town. The place had been a gift from a friend of a friend who knew I was looking for peace. It sounded perfect. The drive was longer than I expected, the road winding through thick forests that made me feel like I was driving deeper into a painting. The trees grew taller and denser as I got farther from the main highway. It was the kind of road that made you realize how small and insignificant you were compared to the vastness of nature. Eventually, I reached the cabin. It was small, made of aged wood, with a slanted roof and a porch that creaked underfoot. There were no neighbors, no signs of life for miles. It looked just like the photos my friend had shown me, perfectly quiet. I opened the front door and stepped inside. The interior smelled of old wood and dust. It was exactly what I needed, nothing fancy. The living room had a fireplace, a couple of chairs, and a small table. The kitchen was bare bones, just a few appliances, pots and pans. There was a small bathroom with a tub, and a single bedroom with a bed that looked like it could have come from a thrift store. The place was cozy, and I felt a sense of relief wash over me. It wasn't luxury, but it was mine for the weekend. I set my bags down, unpacked some food and books, and immediately started a fire in the fireplace. The sound of the crackling wood was comforting, almost meditative. I opened the windows to let in the fresh, pine-scented air, and then decided to explore the area a bit before the sun set. The forest was quiet, save for the occasional rustling of leaves and distant bird calls. The path behind the cabin led down to a small creek. The water was clear, and I could see the rocks at the bottom. It was peaceful, too peaceful, I thought. It was the kind of stillness that made you acutely aware of every sound, every movement. There were no other cabins nearby, no signs of human activity for miles. It was as if the world had forgotten about this place. I took my time walking along the creek, stopping to sit on a large rock by the water's edge. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the ground. I felt a little thrill run through me, an odd sense of being the only person on Earth. But it wasn't a comforting feeling. It felt more like I was an intruder in this silent, ancient place, like the forest was watching me. As the day turned into night, I made my way back to the cabin. I lit some candles and settled into the chair by the fire with a book, but I couldn't focus on it. My mind kept drifting. I kept thinking about the sound of the wind moving through the trees, how the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should have. The wind picked up, howling through the gaps in the windows and rattling the cabin. It felt like the entire forest was alive, pressing in from all sides. The creaking of the old wood seemed to echo louder than usual. I tried to ignore it, but the unease grew. There was something unsettling about the place, something off even though nothing had happened. I brushed it aside, convinced it was just my nerves. It had been a long drive and I wasn't used to the isolation. So, I decided to go to bed early, hoping sleep would clear my mind. But as I lay there in the dark, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The cabin was still, almost unnaturally so. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind or the house settling, but I couldn't ignore the sensation of eyes on me. I pulled the blankets tighter around me, willing myself to sleep. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I knew, I was wide awake again. The clock read 2:34 a.m. The room was dark except for the faint glow of the fire, which had died down to embers. I felt an overwhelming urge to get up, but I didn't know why. There was a noise, something soft, like a scratch. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. It was coming from the front door. I listened intently, trying to convince myself it was just an animal or maybe the wind again. But the sound came again, louder this time. A scraping noise like something or someone was trying to get in. My heart began to race. I had locked the door when I arrived, double-checked it. There was no way anyone could have gotten in. It had to be something else. I slowly got out of bed, moving silently across the floor. The cabin was cold now, and the shadows seemed darker than before. I grabbed the flashlight I had brought with me and shone it toward the door. My hand shook as I approached the window to peek outside. Nothing. No movement, no figures in the dark. Just the same stillness, the same oppressive quiet. I let out a shaky breath and walked back to the door, my mind spinning with possibilities. Maybe a tree branch had caught on the door, or an animal had brushed up against it. I convinced myself it was nothing at all. But as I was about to go back to bed, I heard it again, the scraping noise. This time it was closer, more deliberate. It was coming from the side of the cabin, near the window. I froze. I had no idea what to do. Should I call the police? Was someone out there, watching me? The cabin was isolated, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. No one would hear me if something happened. I crept to the window, my flashlight shaking in my hand. I tried to peer out, but the darkness outside was thick, like a wall. I couldn't see anything. I turned the flashlight off, letting my eyes adjust to the dark. That's when I saw it. A shape, a shadow standing just outside the window. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a tree. It was a person. I couldn't make out any details, just the outline of a figure standing motionless in the dark. My heart raced, and every muscle in my body tensed. I backed away slowly, my feet stumbling over the floorboards. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to run, but where could I go? The only thing I could do was wait. The figure didn't move. It just stood there watching. Minutes passed, maybe more, I don't know. I was frozen in place, too terrified to even breathe. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't make a sound. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure moved away from the window, disappearing into the forest. I stared at the spot for what felt like an eternity, waiting for any sign of movement, but nothing happened. The night returned to its silence. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I stayed in that chair by the window, my eyes darting back and forth, watching for any sign of the figure. But nothing came. When morning came, I was exhausted. My mind felt foggy, my body tense. The sun was up, and the cabin was bathed in the soft golden light of dawn. The forest was still peaceful again, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I didn't know what I had seen last night. Was it real? Had it been a figment of my imagination? I packed my things, my hands trembling as I folded my clothes. I didn't want to stay another night. The sense of unease had grown too strong. I had to leave. I grabbed the keys, locked the door behind me, and made my way to the car. As I started the engine, I glanced back at the cabin. For a moment, I thought I saw something move in one of the windows, but when I looked again, there was nothing. I drove away, not looking back. The further I got from that place, the lighter I felt, like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. But I couldn't forget what had happened. The scraping sound, the figure standing outside the window. What was it? Who was it? I don't know if I'll ever find out, but I'll never go back to that cabin. Not for all the peace and quiet in the world. I never thought a weekend in a cabin could go so wrong. It was supposed to be peaceful, a quick getaway to clear my mind. The cabin was small, isolated, nestled deep in the woods, far away from the noise of the city. I'd rented it for the weekend through a website, simple, no frills. Just a place to unplug and enjoy some solitude. I arrived late, just as the sun was sinking behind the mountains, casting the trees in long, eerie shadows. The road leading to the cabin was narrow, winding, and barely visible from the overgrowth of trees. I didn't mind, though. The isolation was exactly what I wanted. The kind of place you can disconnect, breathe, think. The cabin was older than I expected, but still charming in its own way. It had the kind of rustic feel you see in pictures: wooden beams, a stone fireplace, a few simple pieces of furniture. I didn't care much for how it looked, just that it was quiet. I went inside, unpacked my things, and set up for the night. The only light was the dim glow from the single lamp in the living room and the orange hue of the fireplace crackling away. The air smelled like pine and wood smoke, a scent I would come to know well over the next few days. I made a cup of tea, sat on the old leather couch, and tried to let the quiet wash over me. But even the stillness of the woods didn't feel as peaceful as I'd hoped. I noticed small things. The faint creak of the cabin's wooden frame as if it were settling, the way the wind howled slightly through the cracks in the walls, the rustle of leaves outside. I ignored it all, telling myself that it was just the natural sounds of a secluded cabin in the forest. The first night passed without incident. I slept fitfully, waking up a few times to the howling wind, but otherwise it was quiet. By morning, the world outside was covered in fog, the trees barely visible beyond the porch. It gave the whole place a ghostly feel, but I shrugged it off. It was just the weather, after all. The next day, I spent the morning hiking through the woods. I wasn't a big hiker, but I figured I might as well explore while I was out here. The fog still hung heavily in the trees, thick and dense, making everything feel muffled. Every now and then, I heard something in the distance, a snap of a twig, a rustle of leaves, but I couldn't see anyone. The woods felt unnervingly empty. When I returned to the cabin, I noticed something odd. The door to the shed out back was slightly ajar. I was certain I'd locked it when I arrived. It wasn't a big deal. I assumed maybe it had just blown open in the wind, so I locked it again and went inside. But as I sat down to make myself some lunch, I felt uneasy. My thoughts kept drifting back to the shed, the way the door had been open, the strange feeling in the woods that morning. I convinced myself it was nothing. That evening, I decided to take a walk after dinner. The fog had begun to lift, and the air felt crisper, colder. The silence of the forest was unnerving, but again, I told myself it was nothing to worry about. I walked down the narrow path behind the cabin, where the trees grew thicker. The path eventually led to a small creek, its water running fast and clear. I stopped there for a while, watching the water flow, thinking about how nice it would be to have more time like this. Just to think, to breathe, to relax. As I turned back to the cabin, though, I heard it. A faint noise, like a footstep on the dry leaves behind me. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I turned around, but there was nothing, just trees. My breath caught in my throat. Maybe it was a deer or some animal moving through the woods, but the sound had been too deliberate, too close. I tried to shake it off and continued walking, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. My pace quickened as I neared the cabin, and I felt a sense of relief when I stepped inside and locked the door behind me. That night, I slept fitfully. The wind picked up again, howling through the trees like a distant scream. I woke up several times, hearing what sounded like footsteps around the cabin, the sound of someone moving quietly just beyond my reach. I kept telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks, the isolation getting to me, but the footsteps didn't stop. Every time I drifted back to sleep, they would start up again. Felt like someone was waiting outside, watching. The next morning, I checked the door and the windows. Everything seemed fine, but the feeling of being watched lingered. It was like the woods were pressing in on the cabin, and the longer I stayed there, the more suffocating it felt. I decided I'd leave the next day, just get through the evening, and I'd be gone first thing in the morning. But that night was the worst of all. I woke up to the unmistakable sound of someone banging on the door. It was slow at first, a heavy knock that seemed to come from somewhere far away. Then it came again, louder this time, more insistent. My heart raced. I couldn't move. The knock echoed in the cabin, and then the sound of something dragging across the porch. Felt deliberate, slow. I lay frozen in my bed, too terrified to make a sound. My mind raced through every possible explanation. A prank? A bear? Person? But the dragging sound, that eerie, scraping noise, didn't fit any of those explanations. The knocking stopped, but the dragging continued. It circled the cabin, stopping at each window. I could hear it scraping along the wooden walls. I could hear it breathe, low and labored, as if whatever it was had been waiting for a long time. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and I could see my breath. I held my pillow over my face, but even the muffled sound didn't block the terror creeping into my chest. The door rattled again. This time, the noise was followed by a scratching sound, sharp and urgent. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare look. Every instinct told me to get up, to grab something, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear. Suddenly, the dragging stopped. The cabin was still. I listened, holding my breath, straining my ears for any hint of movement. Felt like hours passed, though I knew it was only minutes. Then, without warning, the scraping sound resumed. This time, it was coming from the back of the cabin. The window. I could hear the distinct sound of something heavy moving across the porch. The window slid open. I jumped, gasping for air, my heart thundering in my chest. The thing outside didn't stop. It just kept moving, as if it knew I was there, waiting for me to do something. The next morning, I didn't wait for the sun to rise. I grabbed my things, packed everything into my car, and drove away. Fast. I didn't look back. It's been a few months now, and I've never told anyone what happened. I don't know who or what was out there, but I know I won't be going back to that cabin. No amount of distance or time can erase the feeling of being watched, of knowing something or someone was out there. I'll never be able to shake the sound of those dragging footsteps, the way they moved in circles around me, waiting. But there's one thing that has stayed with me more than anything. The one moment when the knocking stopped and the scraping ceased. It wasn't the silence that got to me. It was the realization that whoever or whatever was outside didn't need to knock anymore. They had gotten in. I can definitely write a detailed and atmospheric cabin story with a realistic scary scenario and a clear ending. However, writing 7,000 words in a single message is beyond the practical limit of this platform. I can start the story and aim for a detailed, immersive experience, and then I can continue or break it into parts if needed. Let me begin. I had always been the kind of person who appreciated the silence of nature, the calm that comes from being away from the city. So when I found this small, secluded cabin up in the mountains, I thought it would be the perfect place to clear my head. A weekend away from everything. No distractions, no noise, just the sound of trees swaying and the occasional rustle of wildlife. The cabin was about a 2-hour drive from the nearest town, tucked into the side of a forested hill. The kind of place where cell service doesn't exist, and the air feels like it's been scrubbed clean by the distance from civilization. When I arrived, the sky was overcast, the clouds low, and a steady mist hung in the air. It was the kind of weather that made everything feel quieter, heavier. The cabin itself was simple, wooden, with a slanted roof and a small porch. It looked old, but well kept. A wooden rocking chair sat on the porch, facing the forest. There was no one else around, just the trees and the winding dirt path that had brought me here. No neighbors, no cars, not even a mailbox. I unloaded my things into the cabin and started a fire in the small stone fireplace. The inside was cozy with an old couch, a small kitchen, and a loft bedroom that overlooked the living room. Everything smelled of pine and wood, a little musty but not unpleasant. I wasn't here for luxury, just solitude, the kind of quiet that allows you to think. As evening fell, the air grew colder. I wrapped myself in a blanket, settled into the couch, and cracked open a book. The fire crackled in the background, and the only sounds outside were the occasional calls of distant birds or the rustling of leaves. Time slowed down. I hadn't realized how much I needed this. I didn't feel afraid, not at first. But then something happened. It started as a soft thump, just a single noise, faint but distinct. At first, I dismissed it. The cabin was old. Maybe it was just the wind moving something around in the rafters or a tree branch brushing against the roof. But then it came again, louder this time, followed by a scrape, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. I stood up, my heart suddenly thumping in my chest. The room felt colder, the air heavier. I looked around, half expecting to see something move out of the corner of my eye, but there was nothing. Only the fire, burning steadily in the hearth. I told myself it was nothing, probably a critter or an animal outside. Still, the thought gnawed at me, so I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer and walked through the cabin. I checked the windows, making sure they were locked. I looked in the closets and under the bed, shining the beam of light into every shadowed corner. But there was nothing. Nothing except the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. I didn't sleep well that night. I stayed up, listening, watching, and waiting for that same noise to come back. But it didn't. The hours ticked by, and eventually, I nodded off, the fire still flickering softly. When I woke up the next morning, the mist was thicker than before, and the sunlight had a strange, diffused quality to it. I got up, stretched, and walked out onto the porch. The fresh, cool air did nothing to clear my head, but I tried to shake off the unease from the night before. It had been a long, stressful week, and the isolation probably played tricks on my mind. There was no reason to be scared. I made coffee, brewed it slowly in the old pot, and sat outside on the porch, taking in the view of the forest. Everything felt calm again. The air was still, and there wasn't a sound except the occasional chirp of birds. But as I sat there, I noticed something that I hadn't before. Footprints, fresh ones, leading away from the cabin and into the woods. There weren't many, just a few scattered prints in the damp earth, but they were there, and they were large. I felt my stomach tighten. I wasn't sure why, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were too close to the cabin. The prints were too near, almost too deliberate, like someone had been standing there, watching. The thought made the back of my neck prickle. I told myself to stop being paranoid. I was alone in the middle of nowhere, and there was no one out here. But then I noticed something else. A small pile of stones stacked neatly near the porch. It was odd, almost like someone had carefully arranged them. I bent down, inspecting them, but there was no explanation for why they were there. It wasn't something that looked like a natural formation. It looked deliberate. I backed up, my heart beating faster now. I'd had enough. This wasn't normal, not at all. I didn't care about the footprints or the rocks. I was leaving. I went back inside to pack my things. The air felt thick, suffocating, and every creak of the old wood made my skin crawl. I grabbed my bag, throwing in whatever I could find, but just as I was about to head out the door, something caught my eye. A figure, a shadow just outside the window. I froze. It was brief, just a flash, but it was there. A shape, tall and thin, standing motionless in the fog. I could barely make it out, but the way it stood, unnaturally still, made my heart skip a beat. It was too far to see clearly, but I knew it wasn't an animal. Not with the way it moved, or rather, didn't move. I didn't wait around to investigate. I grabbed my keys, slammed the door shut behind me, and rushed to the car. My hands were shaking as I fumbled to start the engine, the headlights cutting through the mist like a knife. The tires kicked up dirt as I sped down the path, but I didn't look back. I drove for what felt like hours, until the mist finally started to thin and the trees began to spread out. I didn't stop until I reached the town, pulling into the first gas station I saw. I parked, sat there for a moment, and took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. I had no idea what had happened out there. It didn't make sense. No one should have been near that cabin, and yet, there they were, the footprints, the stones, the shadow. But I couldn't explain any of it. There was no logical reason for it. And as I sat there, staring at my hands, still trembling from the experience, I realized something. There had been something in the woods, something watching me, but whatever it was, it hadn't followed me. That was the strangest part. If it had wanted to harm me, it would have done so by now. Instead, it had left me alone, and I couldn't help but wonder if that was the point. To leave me with the fear of the unknown. To leave me questioning what was real and what wasn't. But what really haunted me wasn't the things I couldn't explain. It was the feeling of being watched even after I'd left. The way the trees seemed to lean in when I thought I was alone. The silence that now felt unnatural. The unease that clung to me even as I stood in the town, surrounded by people. That night, I went to bed in a motel room, but I didn't sleep. I lay there, wide awake, trying to make sense of everything, my thoughts racing. I'd left the cabin, but I hadn't left the fear behind. And for the first time, I realized that sometimes fear doesn't come from what you see or hear. It comes from what you can't explain. But I had to remind myself that it was over. I was safe. There was no reason to look back. No reason to go back. Yet, the cabin was still out there, hidden in the fog, and the strange feeling I had left with was like a lingering shadow. I didn't know what had happened, but I knew I didn't need to understand it. Some things weren't meant to be understood, and some things were better left alone. I never thought a weekend getaway would turn into the kind of nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I just wanted some peace and quiet. I had been working nonstop for months, the kind of work that gets under your skin, that gnaws at you even in your sleep. So when a colleague mentioned a secluded cabin deep in the woods, I thought it was perfect. No cell service, no distractions, just me, a couple of days, and a little time to clear my head. The cabin was about 4 hours away from the city. I'd driven out there alone, the roads getting thinner and thinner the farther I went, until the trees seemed to close in around me. I was starting to get the feeling that I was out there a little too far, but it wasn't like I had anywhere else to be. The idea of isolation didn't bother me at first, it seemed peaceful. It wasn't until I was standing in front of the old, creaky cabin that I felt a strange pull in my gut. The place wasn't exactly welcoming. The wood was weathered and gray, with moss creeping up the sides like something alive. The windows were small, dark, and narrow, shaped more like slits than actual panes of glass. The door, though sturdy, had a chipped paint job, and there were no welcome signs or any indication that anyone had been there in a while. It looked like it had been abandoned, like no one cared to visit it in years. But I shrugged off my unease. I wasn't here to judge. I was here to relax. I unlocked the door with the key that had been left under the mat. Inside was just as bare as the outside, with only the most essential furniture. An old couch, a small kitchen table, a stove that looked like it could have been from the 1950s, and a fireplace that had clearly been used recently. The floor creaked under my feet. The air smelled like old wood and something faintly musty, but it wasn't unbearable. I set down my bag and unpacked quickly, glad to finally be away from the city. That night, the silence was overwhelming. I hadn't realized how used to noise I'd become until it was gone. There was no hum of traffic, no chatter from passing pedestrians, just the rustling of the trees outside. Every now and then, the wind would whip through the branches, sounding almost like whispering voices, but that was just the wind, right? I spent the night reading a book by the fire, the light flickering off the walls. Eventually, I fell asleep, the soft crackling of the logs the last thing I remember before drifting off. The next morning, I woke up to a strange noise. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, as old houses do, but the more I listened, the more it sounded like footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps. I sat up, my heart racing a little. I couldn't hear the sound of a car outside, so there was no one coming down the road. My phone was still dead, and there were no neighbors for miles. Who could it be? I grabbed the nearest thing I could find to defend myself, which happened to be a fire poker. I stood in the middle of the room, listening, my ears straining to catch any more sounds. The footsteps stopped as abruptly as they had started. A knot tightened in my stomach. Maybe it was just an animal, I thought. The woods were full of life. Maybe it was a deer or something bigger. Maybe it was the wind again, shifting the trees in odd ways that made them sound like footsteps. I tried to calm myself and tell myself it was nothing, but my mind kept racing. Something didn't feel right. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I moved toward the window and peeked through the dusty blinds. I saw nothing, just trees, and the narrow trail leading up to the cabin. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I tried to shake it off and went about my day, making coffee and sitting out on the porch for a while, staring into the woods. But the silence, it felt too loud. The longer I stayed, the more restless I became. Something was off about this place. The longer I was there, the more the walls seemed to close in on me. I decided to go for a walk to distract myself, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. The woods were dense, the trees towering overhead, casting long shadows. The only sound was the crunch of dry leaves beneath my boots. I walked for hours, following a narrow trail that seemed to snake deeper into the forest. The deeper I went, the more I realized that I hadn't seen any other signs of life. No animals, no birds, no people, just trees. The quiet was unnerving. I stopped for a moment to take a sip of water and found myself staring at a strange patch of earth. There was something odd about it, like the ground had been disturbed recently. I crouched down, inspecting the area more closely. It looked like someone had dug a small hole and then covered it up hastily, but not very well. The earth was loose, and the soil had a reddish tint to it. My gut twisted, and for the first time, I felt like I had made a mistake coming here. I quickly stood up, brushing the dirt off my knees, and turned to head back toward the cabin. But as I did, I noticed something else. Footprints. Fresh ones. They were large, heavy, like boots had pressed into the dirt recently. I followed them for a while, trying to ignore the sick feeling rising in my chest. The footprints led toward the cabin, and my heart started to race. I walked back quickly, my steps growing faster the closer I got to the cabin. The door was still locked, just like I'd left it. I checked the windows, looking for any signs that someone had been inside. Everything seemed undisturbed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me. That night, the silence felt even more oppressive. I tried to distract myself with more reading, but I couldn't focus. My mind kept drifting back to those footprints, to the strange hole in the ground. I could feel eyes on me, even though no one was there. The wind picked up again, rustling the trees outside, but this time it didn't comfort me. Felt like a warning. Couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard something outside. A shift in the air, the sound of footsteps moving around the cabin. I forced myself to stay awake, gripping the edge of the couch, heart hammering in my chest. The next morning, I was exhausted, but I knew I needed to leave. I packed up my things, hurrying to get out of the cabin as quickly as possible. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that something was waiting for me just beyond the trees. I was halfway down the trail, my car in sight, when I heard it. A loud crack, like something heavy had snapped underfoot. My heart skipped a beat as I froze, looking around. For a split second, I thought I saw movement in the trees, something large and dark shifting between the trunks. I didn't stop to investigate. I ran the rest of the way to my car, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't look back. I didn't want to. I drove away from that cabin faster than I had ever driven in my life, my mind racing with images of those footprints, the strange hole in the ground, and the feeling of eyes watching me. I've never been back to that cabin, and I don't plan to. I don't know who or what was out there, but I'm sure of one thing. It wasn't just the wind. And I'm certain that there's something buried in those woods that no one should ever disturb.